Hey there, everybody. Um, Thanks everybody for the submissions. I had quite a few. If you've been out, I'm sure you've been seeing quite a few things popping up here and there. I wasn't able to include everything because I only have so much time, but I do appreciate it. And some cool mushrooms might be getting left out, but I do appreciate you guys sending them over. All right, so what's in your neck of the woods? See if I can get this thing to work. Here we go. So I'll start off with slime molds, continuing the last monthly meeting. So April Wyman found some of these guys. I guess she was inspired by last month's meeting. So first one here is fairly common, but this is a little different than what we usually find. Usually these kind of look a little more squiddy, like little tentacles, but if you zoom in close, you can see this actually kind of has a honeycomb pattern going on. So this is still Ceratiomyxa reticulosa, but this is variety Poroides. This next one looks kind of like one you might commonly find called the raspberry slime. But the raspberry slime tends to have more tubes and such. So I think this is actually, this is going to be a fun one, Dictydiathalium plumbium. And this one is more kind of just bumpy on the surface as opposed to actually being little tubes. And this final one is, I think, Fusarium polycephalum. A lot of times the slime molds will have a plasmodium similar to something like this, but then the fruiting body may be different. But I believe this yellow veiny looking one, the polycephalum is many heads. And so you can kind of see all these little yellow bunches is indicating the many heads. All right, moving on. Riley Noel sent this one from Fountainhead. You guys may recognize it, and this is kind of continuing from last month's meeting as well. You can see it's got this very dense reticulation. It's really cool looking. A lot of times when you see reticulation, it's not as deep as this one. It's got the red cap, it's got the red pores. This little edge right here is something, if you're not aware, that you might be able to be aware, something to look for in boletes. A lot of times the guides will mention a sterile edge along the pore surface, and that's what this would be. You can see it has blue staining. This is actually frost bolete. So this is Boletes frostii. You might see it as Boletes frostii or exudoporous, and I think the exudoporous indicates, like, a lot of times when you find this young, it'll have these little droplets all along the dripping from the pores. This one tends to have a sticky cap, and if you were to touch your tongue to it, it's quite sour. It's kind of cool. All right, this one's submitted by Lisa Ham. So this one's fairly common in our area, and it's quite distinct in this really sometimes bright orange cap. Some of the first times I found these, like, it was almost like somebody had gone through with like one of those fluorescent markers, marking areas in the woods or something. You see this fluorescent orange thing, and it's actually the cap of a mushroom. So it's got whitish pores. They'd probably start turning a pinkish color. This is actually one of the Tylopolis. We call this one the burnt orange bolete. If you look close, you can actually see a little bit of light reticulation up here at the apex of the stalk here. And of course the brownish bruising. This one is considered edible, but every time I've nibbled on it, it's been bitter. So kind of a cool find though. Next one here by Jeremy George, found in Salem State Forest. This picture doesn't do the colors very well, although it does kind of show a purplish hue to the cap there. So when you turn it over, you'll see, okay, well, this has some pores, pretty thick stipe with, in this picture, there you can see it's a little bit more brown. He's taken some notes here. And if you zoom in to the pores, you'll see there's some orangey brown staining. You can see how the pores attach to the stipe. And so sometimes this is another good thing to look for when you're trying to identify boletes, and it's the way that the pores attach to the stipe. So one thing I wanted to point out is right here, no distinct taste. So a lot of these dark brown, white pored, a lot of times staining this orangey brown coloration. If you give them a nibble and spit it out, many times you'll find bitter ones, quite bitter in fact. Some will have other features like a brown reticulation or something along those lines that'll lead you in a different direction. But when it doesn't have this reticulation and you taste it and it is mild, that's, there's a couple that look very, very similar, and the taste can be a giveaway. So he also got a picture. He's been, looks like he's getting some practice with his microscope. That's a really nice spore picture, although that doesn't help me too much. But anyway, I think this is Tylopolis baticeps. And so there's some other ones like Rubrobrunus, but if you taste those, they're quite bitter. But being this one was mild, I believe that's baticeps. All right, this one's submitted by Marilyn Dean Mendel. Sometimes you'll see these guys. This one's getting a little bit uprolled, so it's getting a little older. And sometimes when you first find them, there's still that convex cap, and they kind of got this matte look, almost velvety in a way. And if you don't see this undersurface, it looks like these little campestris type boletes. They're little red boletes. A lot of times they stain blue, but you turn this one over and you see, okay, well, this one has gills. Well, these are actually not true gills. These are elongated pores. This is actually considered a bolete. So this is Philoporus rhodoxanthus. They call it the Gilled bolete. And one thing that can prove that is there is a hypomyces, a mushroom mold that only infects boletes, and it will actually grow on this mushroom. All right, this one's submitted by Estella Waldman. This one has some very classic signs. And if you're not aware, this looks very much like a typical Amanita. A lot of times they'll have radial lines like this, and this is kind of like the gills, and in between the gills showing through the top of the cap. If you look close here, you can see it kind of has this vulva cup, which would have been the universal veil covering the entire mushroom. So it would have been like a little egg and it would pop through. Amanita, sometimes you see it'll flake apart and you'll have little patches on the cap, but this one happens to all stay at the base. It has free gills, and most Amanitas will have a ring. This one just happens to not, and that would put it into the gressette group. I think this might be Amanita vaginata. There are quite a few in that group, so I'm not sure that that's exactly the right species, but it sure is close enough. The true gressette or the vaginata is more of a gray cap, whereas they have like a tawny gressette and it has more of a brown cap, and there's a few different color variations there. All right, another submitted by Marilyn Dean Mendel, and I think a lot of you guys recognize this one. It's pretty distinct. You can see the hymenium is kind of wrinkly. It doesn't have gills. It's kind of cross-veiny. It's got these blackish brown gray coloration. This is your typical black trumpet. This is Chanterelles phalanx. That's a quite tasty edible. I had other people who had submitted this as well. So it seems like there's some up. So if you look around Oak Beach woods, maybe by a stream, they do like growing in moss and such. You might be able to find yourself some. Another one by Maryland. This can be a fairly common mushroom. There's a couple that look similar. This happens to be the darker capped variety. It also, if you look close here, it has some kind of wrinkles or corrugations along the margin. A lot of times they'll go all the way over the entire cap surface. You can see these little white droplets. This is a latex where the gills got injured. This one has copious amounts of latex when you cut it or scratch it. And another thing about this dark capped one, the gills usually are a bit darker. So one is Lactarius boletes. This, I believe, is Lactarius corrugus or the corrugated cap milky. They're both good edibles. And they say you can kind of distinguish them. One has a fishy smell and the other one doesn't, but I found they both kind of do. So, all right, here's one submitted by John Harper. This is a very classic image of these. You can see this mushroom down here is actually Sterium ostrea, and this pinkish one is what we're looking at, is almost always found growing within clusters of these Sterium ostrea. When you flip it over, the hymenium is like this wrinkly, phlebia-like, cross-veining, not true gills where the spores are produced, and the cap is this pink color. Oftentimes with this white margin. This is Phlebia incarnata, the coral pink merulius. You can even see there's Sterium growing right from the same place. So I don't know that anybody's actually done studies, but there are some, such as like something like witch's butter, and they've shown that it's actually kind of parasitic on a mycelium of a Sterium growing in the same piece of wood. So that may be what's happening here, but I don't know that anybody's actually done any studies like this. But very often, if you see a log covered in Sterium ostrea, you'll see this emerge at some point. Here's another big polypore submitted by Michael Wang, found in Connecticut. I'm sure a lot of you have seen something like this popping out on fallen logs or stumps like this. So you can see it's got this brownish, kind of shiny, varnished cap, which kind of contributes to its common name. So the naming of these has kind of gone into flux, and I believe this is Ganoderma sessile. So sessile meaning it doesn't have a stem, and you can see this one doesn't have a stem. But there are other features that you can look for by like breaking open and looking at the flesh. And so there can be some like melanized darkish tissue. Sometimes they don't have it, and that can help you distinguish species. So this may be sessile, and it probably is. They tend to grow overlapping like this without the stem. We used to call the ones growing on hardwood lucidum, but that's actually apparently a European species. All right, stately mushroom here, another one submitted by Maryland. Grown from wood, but when you look close, it's got some really cool features to it. So it's got this really fuzzy stipe going on. And even in the cap tissue, you see these kind of woolly hairs poking out. And so when you see something like this, it's also got the decurrent gills. When you see something like this, it always makes me think of something in, one of the big furry Pleurotus. And so there are a couple that this can look like. So Pleurotus dryaenus or Lentinus levis, which also used to be Pleurotus. But it's kind of hard to distinguish between the two. So the Lentinus levis is supposed to have kind of like a more of a velvety fur. The Pleurotus dryaenus is supposed to be more woolly, which is kind of like this. But one thing that helps with this one is if you see this tissue down here, this was actually probably part of a veil. And so before the cap expanded, that little veil was protecting the gills. And so this is most likely Pleurotus dryaenus, the veiled oyster. They can look very similar though. If you and a lot of times, this is really a nice specimen. Usually when we find these, they're really big and old. And sometimes they can get giant, like almost a foot across. It's kind of a fun find. Another one submitted by Marilyn. So this is growing on wood. Oftentimes you find this mushroom growing in mulch, in giant clusters. This classic bulbous base. It's got a very persistent ring, 3 gills. This coloration here is actually a staining reaction, and you can kind of see a bit of a staining reaction here. The first time I found this one and decided I was going to try and eat it, I started cutting it, and let me just tell you the name. So this is Leucogaricus americanus. They call it the reddening lepiota. And so it stains a reddish color. Well, when I first got it, I didn't realize it actually stains yellow, and then that yellow turns to a reddish coloration. So sometimes if you pick this, just from rubbing the stipe, you'll see a yellow coloration, which will slowly turn to that reddish brown coloration. I was looking this, and apparently they're saying not to eat this one anymore. Like, it's been upsetting people's stomachs, so be careful with it. It's very distinct though. And like I said, usually it's found growing in mulch piles and stuff. I don't find this growing on wood too often. Pretty mushroom though. All right, another one submitted by John Harper. This is a fairly common mushroom. A lot of times it's even furrier than this. A lot of times it'll have these kind of scalloped margins. It's kind of hard to tell here. But if you look at the gills, a lot of times this will go all the way to the base. This is actually called the split gill. So it's a pretty big specimen. Usually when you find them, they're a little bit smaller, but they're really cool looking, especially when those split gills go all the way up. It looks very alien. This is Schizophilum commune. One to be aware of, this was found by Felix Mitchell. So sometimes if you're hunting chanterelles and you see something like this, just be aware there is a false chanterelle. This one does have true gills, but when it's young, the gills aren't necessarily knife edged. So it does have this forking, splitting gill structure. One sure way you can separate this from the true chanterelles, this one's usually a much more fragile mushroom. So chanterelles tend to be pretty hefty. The gills on this one tend to be a darker, sometimes almost a reddish orange, where they're going to be lighter on a true chanterelle. This one is also usually found growing from some rotting wood and typically conifer. But it's just good to be aware of if you are, collecting chanterelles, that there is a false chanterelle that can vaguely resemble chanterelles. This is Hygrophoropsis aurantiaca. And I believe that's it. Thanks again, everybody, for the submission. Sorry if I left yours out. Thanks.